Okay, welcome everyone to our 8th Symposium on Economic Policy. So this is organized by the Institute of Financial Economics. Besides our research work and working papers that you can find on our website, the Institute of Financial Economics also organizes many events such as this one. We organize technical seminars, student events, and the symposium series as well. You can find everything on our website and on our Facebook page as well. The Institute of Financial Economics was founded in 1984 thanks to the efforts of the esteemed Dr. Makdisi here and to the generosity of 5 leading local banks in Lebanon. The talk today is about global inflation and also regional trends. And we have with us 2 esteemed speakers that Dr. Makdisi will present. As you can see, we are videotaping this. It will be available on YouTube. Whoever is interested, it will be on our Facebook page, and I can send you the link as well. So now I'll give the floor to Dr. Makdisi, who will present the speakers. Thank you, Dr. Makdisi.
Thank you, Leila.
I'll just do this.
We're very happy that we have 2 distinguished speakers today, despite the weather. And in fact, I want to welcome you all, and I'm really very, very happy to see so many faces in these very difficult weather conditions. The 2 distinguished speakers are, as you already know, Ayhan Kouzi, who is director of the World Bank Group's Prospects Group. He joined the World Bank, in 2014. But prior to that, he was assistant to the director of research department and deputy chief of the Multilateral Surveillance Division at the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Ayhan has written extensively on international macroeconomics and finance, and many of his publications have appeared or have been published in leading academic journals. His research has been featured in government media outlets such as The Economist, New York Times, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, and so on. He is also on the editorial boards of several academic journals and was the founding co-editor of the IMF Economic Review and editor of the IMF Research Bulletin. So, Ayhan, we're very happy that you have come here, and we look forward to whatever you have to say on the question of global inflation and regional trends. The other distinguished speaker is Talal Salman. I know the elder Talal Salman, and he told me that he was his nephew. Yes. You're the nephew of the original Talal Salman. Yeah, I thought there was some kind of mistake in the names maybe, but you're okay. Yeah? Talal has been managing since 2014 a policy advisory team of 30 UNDP professionals at the Ministry of Finance, and note, advising the minister and the administration, among other things, on the implementation of tax and customs revenue, economic policy, debt management, etc., and other subjects as well. And I was just telling Talal, good luck. I don't know to what extent. I mean, I really wish you luck in that. I hope something is being done. Maybe you can tell us something about that, Talal. Before joining the UNDP and the ministry, Talal worked in policy-making, management, consulting, and investment banking at the World Bank and several leading financial organizations. So, welcome, Talal. Thank you. We have scheduled 70 minutes, so I propose to have each speaker speak for up to 30 minutes, which will leave at least 50 minutes for a discussion period. Ayhan, would you please go ahead? Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. First, let me thank you, Leila, Sumru, Samir, for organizing this event and inviting me. I'm very pleased there are a number of people interested in inflation. Thursday, almost evening, wonderful weather outside. So this is my first time in Beirut. I very much enjoyed my visit, and I'm hoping to come back again. Today I'm going to talk about a book we recently released. The title is Inflation in Emerging and Developing Economies, Evolution, Drivers, and Policies. This is a book I produced with Jongrim Ha and Francisca Osong. So whatever I'm going to say today, these are my views. They do not reflect the views of the World Bank Group. The book is available on the web, as you can see, worldbank.org/inflation. It has a very nice, web address. So why you would like to read this book? There is obviously a huge debate on inflation. The lack of inflation is a big challenge. When you have high inflation, it's another challenge. But nowadays, after a prolonged period of time, when and whether inflation will come back an issue. And that issue has been extensively discussed in the context of advanced economies. In the context of emerging market developing economies, which here I'm going to use this acronym EMDEs, referring to all countries except advanced economies, our understanding of inflation is somewhat limited in the following way. Inflation has gone down in advanced economies and has gone down pretty much everywhere around the world, except some countries. And there has been quite a bit of work looking at why and how inflation declined in advanced economies. Not much work on in emerging market and developing economies looking at this issue and the sources and implications. So this is the first comprehensive study on this issue, inflation in emerging market developing economies. Another quality of this book, it brings all types of cutting-edge methods used in the context of studies looking at inflation in advanced economies and brings them to emerging market and developing economies. And finally, there is a database we put together. We claim that this is a global database. It has 175 countries, 34 advanced economies, and 141 emerging developing economies. From 1970 to 2018, we have multiple measures of inflation, and of course, we collected data for many country characteristics. The book is on the web. All the figures and tables and underlying data, they are available on the web as well. You can download it, play with it, and use it for your own purposes. For today's presentation, very shortly, I'm going to go over 4 questions. I'm not going to discuss technical issues. I will just show you some figures and explain some facts and provide intuition. Question number 1, how has inflation evolved in emerging market and developing economies? The second question, what have been the global and domestic drivers of inflation? I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on global drivers of inflation there. Third, very important question, how well anchored are inflation expectations in emerging market developing economies? And finally, I will discuss the policy implications of, the book. So let me start with the first question. How has inflation evolved in emerging market developing economies? Now, when you look at these inflation dynamics around the world, the first thing you see, inflation has declined. Here on the left, you see global CPI inflation. This is inflation, the median inflation of 152 countries. In 1974, inflation was about 17%, median inflation. That number went down to 1.7% in 2015. It went up a little bit since then, but it's still quite low. So this decline in inflation has led to all types of course, analytical work, but on the policy side, created enormous challenges, especially policymakers in advanced economies and central banks. On the right, you see the change in inflation over time in advanced economies and emerging market developing economies. And what you see there, for advanced economies, inflation was about 15% in 1974. Since then, declined. In fact, in 2015, went down to 0.3%. It's median inflation in advanced economies. For emerging market developing economies, you know, for a long period of time, especially Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, you had countries with very high inflation, many emerging market developing economies. But those days are behind us. In emerging market developing economies as well, inflation has declined significantly relative to early 70s from about 18% all the way down to 2.5%, 3%, median inflation. Now, there's another way of thinking about this issue. You can just look at, you know, the countries. Here, these are, you can think of these histograms or density functions. You see that irrespective of country group you look at, first of all, the inflation median or mean moved to the left and the entire distribution skewed to the left. For advanced economies, for example, more than 60% of them now experience inflation in the post-crisis period less than 1%. But this is a remarkable number. For emerging market developing economies, 9 out of 10 actually emerging market developing economies, now they have inflation single digits in the post-crisis era. Even low-income countries, they tend to have, you know, 25, 30, 40, 50% inflation, now able to manage inflation at much lower rates. So why we have seen such dramatic changes in inflation over time, this disinflation that has been the topic of many analytical studies. The first reason is basically the forces of globalization. When countries integrate into the global economy through, for example, trade integration, especially when they become part of a value chain, that translates into more competition and comes with, of course, over time productivity growth. And this creates pressure on domestic inflation. When an economy integrates financially, that basically translates into an anti-inflation bias on the part of central bank, primarily because international financial markets forces central bank policymakers to implement policies that are going to control inflation. The second important reason around the world, relative to 70s, policy frameworks have improved, and they have improved dramatically. When you look at monetary policy frameworks, what you see is that they are more well-defined in the sense that policymakers have well-defined targets. They have a better understanding of exchange rate movements, and because of these, they are able to anchor inflation expectations much better today relative to, of course, the 70s. Now, over time, there has been significant improvement in independence of central bank and transparency of central bank policies. In the 70s, you had actually secrecy around monetary policy. And of course, there was a tight connection between governments and the central banks. Now, in a number of advanced economies and emerging markets, central bank policies are determined by central bankers, independent of course, government wishes. Along with that, fiscal frameworks have improved, That translated into more credibility, of course, on the part of monetary policy. There were some structural factors in some countries that led to a decline in inflation. Product and labor markets became more flexible, increasing competition and reducing wage rigidities. Population aging in some cases, of course, dampened domestic demand growth, in turn creating downward inflation pressures. And technology promoted competition and productivity growth. And finally, of course, there were some major cyclical shocks during this period. The last one was global financial crisis that was followed by the euro area debt crisis. Oil price fluctuations and energy prices in general played a significant role in driving inflation dynamics, and we had a major collapse in oil prices over the period 2014-16. So there are many factors when we think about the disinflation we observed over the past 50 years that basically translated this outcome. The problem is that as economists, you would like to put all of these together and look for a smoking gun. How come inflation has declined in this way and at these low levels? Unfortunately, there is no smoking gun. We spent quite a bit of time looking for that, but it wasn't possible. So what was possible is to look at these things in simpler frameworks, and I will show you some basic results. The first thing is that the connection between inflation and openness. If you simply look at countries that are very open and those that are not that open, so you basically take countries and split them into groups and look at countries in the top quartile of openness versus bottom quartile of openness, what you see is that countries that are more open financially tend to have lower inflation rates. This is true also in the case of trade openness. Those countries that are more open to trade flows tend to have lower inflation. I mentioned the changes in monetary policy, and those changes were dramatic. And there are dramatic differences in terms of inflation outcomes. Basically, countries that switch to inflation targeting regimes with well-defined, decisive frameworks, not just in the books, but in terms of implementation, have much lower inflation rates than those they do not have inflation targets. Of course, in some countries, central bank independence has improved significantly over time, and those countries, they have independent central banks. They decouple monetary policy from other policies of the government, ended up with much lower inflation. So there are clear linkages between certain characteristics. These characteristics could be structural, these characteristics could be related to policies, and certain countries end up those features that translated into much lower inflation. So in the book, there are all types of exercises, more sophisticated. We look at these issues. Now, let me turn to the second question. What have been the global and domestic drivers of inflation? And there, of course, there is a wide range of shocks one can think of. What we did in the book, we looked at what we call a global inflation cycle. For that, what do you do is you basically try to estimate a dynamic factor model. That factor model picks up the common movements in inflation. And here, since we are looking at advanced economies and emerging market developing economies, you have also group-specific factors that pick up commonalities in inflation in those two groups of countries. So what do you learn when you do this exercise? The objective of the exercise is very simple. We are asking the following question. Is there a global inflation cycle? So in some cases, maybe inflation just went down because there are these common forces that push inflation down everywhere. And even though a country does not have all these good qualities in terms of central bank independence, inflation targeting, ended up experiencing low inflation because inflation basically declining in the outside world. So the answer to that question is yes, indeed there is an inflation cycle, and that cycle has a significant global common component. For all economies, that cycle explains about 12% of the variation. For advanced economies, around 25%. These group-specific factors are important, but at the aggregate, they play a much less important role than the global factor. Of course, the next question is, so this exercise on the left is the full sample, for the full sample. Has this global inflation cycle become more prominent over time as we saw, low inflation, and the low inflation has become more persistent? The answer is that, again, there is, evidence suggesting that the global inflation cycle has become more powerful over time, in the sense that it explains a larger variation of inflation in advanced economies, emerging market developing economies, and of course in the global economy as well. So think about what happened in the 70s. You observe, synchronized movements in inflation. Why? Because there were common shocks, the first oil price shock, second oil price shock. And then you come to this period, 1986 to 2000, you don't have many common shocks, the types of very powerful common shocks you used to have in the 70s and early 80s. And then, of course, in the post-crisis era, we had multiple common shocks, including the global financial crisis, as well as the oil price collapse I mentioned. So the bottom line is that you see a global inflation cycle, and that cycle in the data appears to be quite powerful in terms of what? Driving movements in domestic inflation rates in different countries around the world. So one way of thinking about the importance of the inflation cycle is comparing it with the global business cycle. So one thing people know, it is simply impossible to isolate economic conditions in one country from the economic conditions in the rest of the world. So what happens in the rest of the world has implications for, pretty much all countries, especially more open ones. Because of that, we always think about a global business cycle. When you basically look at the importance of global business cycle and compare it with the global inflation cycle, what you learn is that here the variance share explained by these cycles, in fact, actually global inflation cycle is much more powerful than the global business cycle. In other words, what happens to prices outside of your country have huge implications to what happens to prices in your country. And this is something universal. And over time, of course, both the business cycle and the inflation cycle have become more powerful. So what happens to inflation during certain periods that relate to, significant downturns in output growth and significant, basically declines in oil prices? Here, when you think about significant downturns, I'm thinking about what happened in the mid-70s. There was a global recession. What happens in the early 80s? There was a global recession. What happens in the early 90s? There was a global recession. And what happened in 2009? There was a global recession. So when you have global recessions, of course, activity around the world plunges. And as you can see here, inflation declines. What happened over these periods, though, as you can see, 2009 global recession was associated with a decline in inflation, but the level of inflation was much lower than the level of inflation in the global recession in mid-1970s. Oil prices are critical for the headline inflation. They are very critical for the headline inflation. Here, what we looked at oil price changes at any 7-month period. If oil price basically declines by about 30%, we call that an oil price plunge. That type of decline happened in 1986. It happened 1991. It happened 2008, and it happened 2014-16. Of course, the 86 is associated with OPEC policies. 14 and 16 is associated with OPEC policies. 2008 is the global recession and crisis, and early 90s is a combination of forces. And all of these episodes, you see the inflation actually declines prior to the episode and then stays stable. Now, you can do many things with this rich data set. One of them is to look at drivers of global inflation. And we did that. When you do that, what you see is basically the primary drivers of global inflation is global oil price shocks. Oil price shocks play a very important role, and global demand shocks. So those two together account for about 80% of movements in global inflation. The supply shocks account for only 20%. So this decomposition, you can do it basically over time. When you do it over time, what you see is in the 70s, early 80s, these demand shocks and oil price shocks important. And the post-2000 period, global demand shocks, of course, much more important than the supply shocks, as you basically have more observations from the global financial crisis. You can do this exercise for post-2010, and what you see is that the oil price shock is very important driver. So throughout, in this exercise, we look at headline price inflation. I'm not going to discuss the same exercise in the context of domestic prices, but that exercise is available. Let me turn to the question about inflation expectations. So inflation is all about people's expectations. If people do not expect inflation is going to go down, inflation won't go down. If people expect inflation is going to go down, inflation will go down. So for central banks, it is critical to make sure they manage these expectations. In fact, the most important job of a central banker is to manage expectations about prices. So if you look at inflation expectations, in the context of advanced economies, central bankers did an excellent job, probably much better than what they wanted to do. So as you can see, in the early 90s, inflation expectations median in advanced economies was close to 4%. It is now around 2%. In some actually countries, major economies, it is less than 2%. Of course, the 2% number is not a coincidence. It is the target inflation rate for many of these advanced economies. Now, what happened to inflation expectations in emerging market developing economies? The first thing you observe here, inflation expectations to some extent decline in these economies as well since 1995. However, these expectations are still quite volatile. In other words, when inflation expectations are quite stable in advanced economies, in emerging market developing economies, whereas you see still relatively higher and more volatile inflation expectations. So what does that mean? That means that still, when you see a sudden, unexpected change in inflation, that has impact on inflation expectations. So what does that mean? So every month inflation data released, and prior to that release, financial market participants have an expectation about what the inflation is going to be. So in advanced economies, if the inflation surprises upwards or downwards, inflation expectations do not change. In other words, sensitivity of inflation expectations to inflation shocks almost zero. Why? Because the public and the financial market participants think that central banks will get the inflation to its target even if it deviates from the expectation. In the case of emerging market developing economies, unfortunately, when inflation surprises upwards, there is a movement in inflation expectations. And that's basically what you see on the left. This is the important thing here. When you come to 2005-2018 period, as you can see, this confidence band is not non-zero. But for emerging market developing economies, even though these sensitivity to inflation shocks decline, it is still statistically significantly different than zero. Now on the right, you see how these sensitivities change over time in advanced economies, and you come to the post-crisis period. Basically, now this is in the neighborhood of zero. You cannot basically differentiate the median number from zero. What about emerging market developing economies? So there's still a decline in sensitivity to inflation shocks, but the sensitivity to inflation shocks remain basically statistically significantly different than zero. In other words, emerging market developing economies were able to reduce inflation expectations, but still these expectations are quite sensitive to sudden movements in inflation. So, in what countries the sensitivity to inflation expectations decline? The first thing is that countries that basically implement inflation targeting regimes tend to see a reduction in the degree of sensitivity of inflation expectations to these shocks. Another important result is that countries, they have central bank independence relative to those that do not have, end up with a meaningful change in the degree of sensitivity of inflation expectations to inflation shocks. And that's not the case in the case of emerging market developing economies. So what are the policy implications? Very quickly. Yeah. So in 2003, Ken Rogoff gave a speech at Jackson Hole about actually global inflation. And in this speech, he said that this is 2003, okay, 16 years ago. The greatest threat to today's low inflation, at that time we thought that inflation is low, actually it's now much lower, of course will be a reversal of the modern trend toward enhanced central bank independence, particularly if trend economic growth were to slow, owing, say, to a retreat in globalization and economic liberalization. So this was in 2003, not 2018. So is low inflation here to stay? Of course, there are some cyclical and structural factors we need to think. There are reasons that could lead to higher inflation. Number one, if the global slack dissipates, that could translate into rising wage pressures with very tight labor markets, especially in major advanced economies. If I gave this presentation 5 years ago, I would say the same thing. This issue, the wage pressures because of tight labor markets, have not materialized in the context of inflation yet. Second, slowing globalization. As you know, some major economies impose sizable tariffs. These tariffs are already in place, and sooner or later, they might have an impact on inflation. So there are consequences of trade tensions when we think about inflation. Third, weakening monetary policy frameworks. In major economies, as well as in some emerging market developing economies, there are serious threats to central bank independence, even though central bank independence is in the laws of these economies. Fourth, in a number of countries, weakening fiscal policy frameworks and rising debt levels, along with a serious reform fatigue when it comes to structural reforms. In an environment, what we see a rising protectionist sentiment could lead to pressures on the central banks. And of course, that pressures are always and everywhere associated with large public debt levels. We see that in advanced economies, we see that in emerging market economies. Of course, populist policies accompanied by growing labor market rigidities will translate into the types of inflation we saw in the 1970s. In fact, global economy did experience low inflation in the past. During the gold standard era, 1913-18, we had very low inflation. During Bretton Woods system of exchange rates, we had low inflation. These were rather long periods, and they ended with high inflation. The question is that whether this period of low inflation will change sometime soon. So what are the big policy implications? I think central bankers have to learn how to live with the global inflation cycle. You would like to generate inflation at home, but if there is no inflation in the rest of the world, it could be difficult to generate inflation at home. So, number one, I think policy message to establish more resilient monetary policy frameworks. That is always associated with central bank transparency and independence, and having credible monetary policy frameworks and robust exchange rate regimes. Second, building resilience to changes in global inflation that will require counter-cyclical policy, which requires, of course, policy space. And improving fiscal frameworks, the financial frameworks, and thinking the coordination between monetary policy and other policies. So let me quickly summarize. I focused on 4 questions. Number one, how has inflation evolved in emerging market developing economies? It has declined over time. This was driven by sharp fall in global inflation, as well as a number of cyclical and structural developments. Second, what have been the global and domestic drivers of inflation? There is a wide range of shocks you can consider, but there's definitely an emergence of this global inflation cycle. And the global shocks have become more important over time, even though domestic shocks are still quite important. Third, how well anchored are these inflation expectations in emerging market developing economies? Indeed, these expectations become better anchored over time, but they are still remain less well anchored and volatile in these economies relative to advanced economies. And finally, what are the main policy implications? Maintaining low inflation rate may become as difficult as achieving it. Strong policy frameworks are necessary to maintain it. So let me end with just a little advertisement. We have an extensive set of publications. We have our flagship publication, Global Economic Prospects. We release in January and June. We follow commodity markets. And of course, we have a monthly publication about the state of the global economy. And there is a rich set of studies on the web page you can download. But let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayhan. Thank you very much. Talal?
Yes.
Move it, huh? Thank you.
Okay, well, Well, I have to thank Ahan because, because of reports like his, we actually can do our job in policy making. So this is very useful to me personally. So I thought, I hadn't decided what I'm going to talk about before I came here, but you touched on very important concepts. So maybe I can try to see how we can adapt that to the local situation in Lebanon, because I think that might be of interest to everyone. So I'm going to touch upon, all the major points and try to see how that applies to Lebanon and what are the challenges we're looking at. Besides the fact that we're making less cars and planes and microchips in Lebanon this year, assuming we have a real economy. So I'm going to start by discussing a very important concept that you mentioned regarding the decoupling of fiscal and monetary policy. You proved it empirically that if you do not decouple them, you will end up with higher inflation. Another important point is the fact that if you don't have an inflation targeting regime, you will also end up with higher inflation. So I would like to take a step back to discuss the Lebanese economic and financial model that we have set up for ourselves approximately 30 years ago, and to ask the question, is it still working for us? Going back a little bit to 101 economics, if you all remember the impossible trinity. So we practically, any country is not able to have a fixed exchange rate, an inflation targeting policy, and an open, financial system. By the way, everything I say represents my views, by the way, neither the UNDP, neither the ministry. So the question is, we have a fixed exchange rate regime and we have an open financial system. So therefore, we cannot have an inflation targeting policy. So most of our inflation is besides the fact that it's imported, because our consumption is around 70% of imported goods. So that makes Lebanon more on the receiving end when it comes to price fluctuations. I am a proponent of the fixed exchange rate system, but however, there are immense pressures on it currently. So if we look at the early 90s and when the decision was made to fix the exchange rate, the intention was to bring capital back to Lebanon. And fixed exchange rate does provide a certain level of confidence to depositors. And it has empirically been proven over time that if you're a small open economy, a fixed exchange rate insulates you from volatility, and you're better off not having a flexible exchange rate regime. And this has worked very well for Lebanon in terms of attracting deposits. For example, one major inflow of capital came during the financial crisis. So, Lebanon is kind of insulated. All economies are impacted by the world economy, but Lebanon is to a lesser extent. In 2008 and 2009, for example, Lebanon received around $25 billion of inflows to the economy. We practically wiped them out the past few years, but they were a very important buffer for a major crisis like the Syrian war, which has major implications on the Lebanese economy in the past 8 years. So it has worked in a certain way, but maybe 30 years ago we didn't really calculate the amount of corruption that will accumulate in the financial system over 30 years. So, which means the decoupling of the monetary and fiscal policy has become super hard. So today, the central bank holds approximately 50% of the Lebanese debt, if not a little bit more. So it becomes a vicious circle where the government is in constant need to finance itself because of major corruption and inefficiencies and so on. The central bank is holding a large amount of reserves, which are very important to defend the currency, becomes indirectly responsible to fill the void that the fiscal policy has created. So the failure in fiscal policy has increased the role of the central bank, which has to intervene, obviously. But we ended up with a business model that is unsustainable. So the question becomes, how do we come out of it? So, for example, inflation last year was around 6%. This year we expect it to be around 4.5%. We have a statistician from BDL and the economists of the World Bank who can confirm if they have the same expectations. While our growth has been, close to zero. So what happens to the purchasing power of the Lebanese household? So if you look at, for example, the salary scale increase that was, very right in place towards, public sector workers who have not had a salary increase with an accumulated inflation over the years. But at the same time, the government cannot afford it. So what do? You end up with, more money caused by the need to do an expansionary monetary policy, which is by itself is limited, given that you have a fixed exchange rate and you're importing most of your inflation. You end up with a bigger monetary base, which will end up creating more inflation as we go along. You touched as well on the oil price shocks. So Lebanon is the king of inefficient use of oil. So I mean, if we start with a major, fiscal problem, which is the transfers to support the electricity company. So out of the $86 billion debt that Lebanon is holding today, approximately $30 billion are caused by accumulated deficits of the electricity company. And $30 billion is approximately the same amount that we have in market-traded fixed income instruments, which are called Eurobonds. So the dollar Eurobonds that Lebanon currently holds almost entirely come from the deficit of paying the oil bill, which, at the end of the day is an obscene amount. So as you saw, I saw with you that now there's an electricity power plant to try to save the sector. Let's hope it gets implemented. But those $30 billion are causing us approximately $2.3 billion per year in interest costs. So that limited fiscal space that was created in the budget over 30 years caused by this failure has removed all potential spending that can go towards productive sectors or can go towards healthcare or education or any other sector that could use this money, which has strengthened the real estate sector, which has become intertwined with the financial sector, and you have inflation going to the Lebanese household, reducing the purchasing power. At the same time, you see the real estate prices going up, except the past few years. So even though the intention of, for example, the central bank to give subsidized loans to help low-income people buy houses, it ends up helping the developers, practically saving them from excessive borrowing, or it saves the banks from bad debt. So I don't think a city like Beirut should have an apartment that costs $2 million. This is your first time in Beirut. If you step out of AUB and you look at the buildings in front of AUB, you would have to pay $2 million to buy an apartment. And I think this is abnormal for the average Lebanese income, for the real estate prices to be that high. And I think this is all part of the structural problem in the Lebanese economy. So the first area where the oil shocks, really impact the fiscal situation and hence the monetary situation, because when the government needs to borrow more money, it's putting more pressure on the reserves of the central bank. And when you put more pressures on the reserves of the central bank, you put more pressure on the capability to manage your monetary policy. So expectations in this case become counterproductive. For example, in Lebanon, any purchases of capital goods or real estate are halted completely. I have people sometimes calling me to ask me, I need to buy a new fridge. Do you think prices will go down? Should I buy the fridge? And I'm telling everyone, no, don't buy the fridge, because next year the fridge is going to cost you less. Those are different signs, different reasons behind the inflation in Lebanon. The second area where we're very susceptible to price shocks when it comes to oil is the transport sector. So we have a super failing transport sector. There's no public transport. So the consumption of fuel in Lebanon is ridiculous. We have 1.7 million cars on the roads, and that's a lot of cars. So, and that's adding to pollution. Beirut is now one of the most polluted cities in the world, and there's barely any factory in it. And that has, major implications when it comes to, being part of the Paris Climate Change Agreement or getting any money to be able to adapt to what's coming later on. And it all ties up to the fiscal and to the monetary policies, because they are so intertwined that the cost is always ending up on both. A third area is obviously, heating. I mean, we're still using super, backward ways to heat, and we're using HFO, we're using diesel, so all that adds up to the cost on the household, which ends up with less money, therefore keeping whatever money they have and waiting for inflation to go down in order to be able to buy their capital goods. And that reduces the wallet of the government as well, and that reduces reserves and increases volatility on the economy as a whole. So the question is, what do we do? Either we wait for the business model and then possibly Trinity to blow up, or we need to go back and look at the productive sectors. So when the world economy is doing well and demand is up everywhere, the Lebanese economic growth stays the same, because one car bomb or one machine gun on the street is enough to wipe out 2 million tourists, and then your main bill in the economy disappears. So when China is consuming more or the United States is consuming more, I don't think Lebanon feels it. The only thing we feel is maybe a little bit of increase in remittances, because the only people who are actually really working, besides us, of course, here in the room, are living abroad. So remittances is the only real driving economic force that I can see getting transferred constantly to the Lebanese economy. We should be less dependent on tourism. We should, obviously do all the structural reforms that Dr. Haraki proposes in his reports, the structural reforms. And then if we end up with proper structural reforms, we will reduce the pressure on the central bank. And then maybe when the central bank, the pressure on the central bank is reduced, they can actually think a little bit more about inflation targeting. But when they're always in crisis mode, trying to finance the government and trying to defend the currency and trying to bring back the dollars to the economy at a very costly price, even though it was needed, it becomes, constantly in a battle. And it cannot really observe how to take advantage or protect itself from any global inflationary trends. The solution, in my opinion, because, I'm trying to take the policy-making angle here, is to definitely support the productive sectors in the Lebanese economy. We have to go back to the basics, to our agriculture, to our industry. We should stop bailing out the real estate sector. The banks, they have to be bailed out because it's people's money there. But at the same time, there has to be potential consolidation maybe of the financial system. But without the economic policies and the proper structural reforms, we will always be on the receiving end. And now, we're very lucky that oil prices have went down, because our bill has, the government bill for electricity has reached at a certain point $2.2 billion. And then we were lucky when prices went down. 1 year we paid $970 million, the year after 1.2. Last year we were back to 1.8. So the sooner the better on the solution for the electricity sector. But we need to insulate ourselves from global shocks to commodity prices, and we are able to do that if we shift to gas instead of heavy fuel oil and diesel. And we will be able to give more independence to the central bank when we actually help it decouple from the government failures on the fiscal side. So those are my comments. Try to link them as much as possible to your presentation. So thank you.
Thank you, Talal.
Well, I'm sure they must have made very many questions. I already have several of them I would like to ask, but I'm going to defer and open the floor to questions to either of the two speakers. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm gonna,
Do we need the mic, the microphone? The microphone, maybe an extra mic? Leila? Anybody has a pen?
It's okay, I got one.
so I'm gonna ask about inflation actually. So regarding inflation, I mean, in the advanced economies, I think the struggle now is that increasingly inflation expectations are not necessarily well at. So for example, the five-year swap in the European area, so the European Central Bank is looking at this and it's at 1.2, whereas they want it at 2%. The Fed is struggling with the same thing, inflation undershooting. And people are talking increasingly more about, frankly speaking, central bank independence in the advanced economies, not in the developing economies. And they're talking about that symmetrical 2% inflation target, whereby basically you make up for undershooting. So there are big, what I'm trying to say is that there are big changes at the level of the advanced economies. And that I'm not sure how this is going to reflect on the emerging markets and developing economies. So if you can comment on this. The question on that, so we always say it's the value chain markets, the globalization and the value chain, and now we're moving towards, in fact, I'm not sure how to call it, a less globalized world. But if value chains are integrated, why do you think that's going to affect inflation? So people now talk about technology and all what's happening in terms of tech as a potential cause of lowering inflation. So what would be the transmission channels? If you can comment on that as well.
Thanks. I'm going to take two more questions. Yes, go ahead.
I like about the crisis that taking place between the USA and China, and now we are talking based on this economic crisis about a real phenomenon. It's the stagnation and inflation. While usually inflation comes with the prosperity and development of the market. So, what do you think about this phenomenon and how could it take place and affect the market? And the second question, you also mentioned that the central bank manages the expectations for the inflation. Why don't they play a role in monitoring or steering these expectations so we can change the behavior of these change makers, for example? So why we have to follow these expectations instead of leading them?
Question. I'm not an economist. I'm actually a high school teacher, and I did teach here for years, but I live back in the States now. And I just would like to hear more about hope for the Lebanese economy, because I'm not an expert on it, but I did live here. I lived here privileged. I didn't live here, as many people do. I just would like to hear more hope. I heard a lot what you said, Mr.
Salman.
Salman, thank you. I heard a lot what you said, and I appreciate it. I guess I'd like to hear more hope if you have some, maybe more flesh out some of the things that you said. I just would like to be encouraged on that.
Okay, let's can I have these three questions answered, and then I'll go another round. And go ahead.
So thank you. I think these are very good questions. The first one, the inflation has been undershooting in the euro area and the United States. That is unfortunately true. In fact, last week there was the European Central Bank Sintra meetings, and this was the last meeting of President Draghi. And obviously the euro area policymakers have to find ways to push these expectations up, and they already indicated that they will provide additional accommodation. In the case of US as well, inflation expectations have been softening, and the Fed indicated it is desire to basically reduce interest rates if incoming data remains weak. Now, with respect to changes in policy frameworks, there is a discussion underway, especially in the context of the Fed, to think about the monetary policy framework and how that relates to inflation in the US. And in the case of Euro area and Japan, of course, they are still employing heavy unconventional policies, so the story is different there. I think over the next 2 to 3 years, we might see some changes indeed in terms of what types of inflation measures they follow, how they will translate it into monetary policy. In the context of inflation targeting, they might think about this, asymmetric approach, basically trying to push the inflation up a little bit above target and then see whether they can take it back down. But these are all, preliminary, and we need to see how these things will play out. In terms of global value chains and retreat from globalization, I think one impact of these changes, there's a reason why people basically, go to certain supermarkets. It's convenience, or the prices are cheaper. When you force people to go to another supermarket and buy from there, probably they are facing different types of challenges or higher prices. So if there are barriers in terms of how countries trade with each other, and those barriers are so high, certain value chains disrupted, sooner or later, the cost of these changes will be felt by, of course, consumers. Even though today, for example, something was produced in China, tomorrow it's possible to move that to somewhere else in Asia, there is a reason why it was produced in China in the first place. Like, you go to the same supermarket for the reason. The technological change, of course, it's very important. These very large retailers, online retailers, have certain market power that in some cases have implications in terms of prices of certain goods, but not necessarily at the aggregate price level. So there is not much evidence for that. The stagnation and inflation issue is a critical one. Of course, during the financial crisis, that was the main scare. It is an issue in the context of Japan. It has been there for a long time, very low growth and low inflation. This is an issue, a big challenge for the European policymakers. But for the global economy, that is not the case. Actually, the global economy did rather well in 2017, 18. Even this year, growth is slowing, but it's still at a level right around the potential. So the inflation remains low, but the growth is there. In terms of central bank managing expectations, obviously they are doing their best to manage expectations, to push the expectations up. They have all types of, unconventional measures, including forward guidance. Forward guidance is all about basically trying to, affect the yield curve and the asset prices, but ultimately inflation expectations as well. In some cases, it is more effective. In some other cases, it's not. But these questions clearly show that central bank policies are going through a period of transition. And during this transition, there will be a lot of trial and error, and hopefully we will learn how to manage expectations and push the inflation up.
Thank you, Talal.
Are you planning to move back or?
No.
Okay, good.
Our kids are in America, so
Okay. Well, I mean, I also would like to be more hopeful. I mean, I moved back to Lebanon to give back to my country because I believe that, at the end of the day, we will see the light. So, I mean, this year, at least, a lot of effort has been put in the budget A lot of work has been put. I mean, we have to be fair. But the question is it enough? Not the budget itself, but is it enough as a measure to be able to restructure a problem that is 30-year-old actually? So the accumulation of debt, which is crippling the financial system and the ability to do any fiscal or monetary policy, is the real problem. And the only way to reverse that trend is to be able to raise more money in the economy, be it through growth or be it through better structural reforms. And if you look at the composition of the Lebanese government expenditures, you cannot really touch salaries. You can stop hiring, but you cannot take money away from people who are already struggling. And you cannot do anything about the debt because it's there. And you can solve the electricity problem, which takes a few years. So you look at the revenue side. The revenue side, what's funny is that there's always a lot of sectors that are mentioned that are inefficient, not to use other words, but they do nothing about them. So I mean, you do have amazing programs in place. The World Bank has put SADR together. I mean, you have the Electricité du Liban plan. There's always good proposals. There's always a proposal to liberalize the telecom sector and so on, but it hasn't been done. So the question is, how are we going to implement? So the public-private partnership, the law stayed in the drawers for maybe 15 years. Now we have it. Why aren't we using it? Elections were 1 year ago. The government was formed 4 months ago. What have we done? So the point is, we need to move faster. Implementation needs to move faster. The Council of Ministers needs to be meeting twice a day, like the Parliament is meeting twice a day. We don't have I don't think we have the luxury of time. We have to move very, very fast. And if we liberalize a lot of our sectors, and if we include the private sector, the real private sector, not someone who just decided to become an expert in something yesterday, real private sector, I think that would be a major help to the government. So I think that would be the hope. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dalal. There was a question over there.
Actually, thank you for the presentation. I have a small comment, if you may, regarding the speech of Mr. Salman. It's not really a real mechanism, the remittances in Lebanon, because Lebanon it's a receiving country, besides is remitting backward. So on the net level, it's around 1.82 billion. I don't think it's a good economic real mechanism. Another comment, which by the way, I totally agree with your micro plan. Which is, I think the main problem resides in the mentality of the Lebanese people that is governing this country. I think they have a lack of patriotism. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree on the remittances. There's definitely an outflow, but if you add to them a little bit the personal capital flows of Lebanese professionals, they are keeping the system alive, and whenever the things are better in the Gulf countries or in Africa or in the US, you see the reserves of the central bank, let's say, go up, and all this accumulation of the capital side of the balance of payment. But I'm 100% with you that you cannot count on it. I mean, that's the problem. We have been. I mean, I wrote an article, a few months ago saying that Lebanon is suffering from the Dutch disease. Because the Dutch disease, which usually is caused by an inflow of dollars caused by a natural resource, makes the country slack, kills the productive sectors, and you end up with a suboptimal economic growth. Lebanon is suffering from it because of the remittances. So we've been having so much capital flows from abroad that we have become lazy because the availability of dollars is there, and we killed our productive sectors. So I totally agree with you. And on the patriotism as well, they care about other stuff more than, I don't think they agree on one Lebanon to start with before they can agree on how to manage it.
Perhaps, go ahead.
So thank you for the two presentations. So given this lockdown situation in Lebanon, where theoretically speaking, the three tools would be decreasing the tax, which is not possible, or decreasing the governmental spending, which is also not possible because we have to pay a lot of debt for electricity, interest, etc., or increasing growth, which is not possible because of tight fiscal space. So the window might be focusing on private investments or trying to attract foreign investments or capital inflows. But again, the problem is that let's say one wants to open to start an investment in Lebanon. The process is very hard because there's no clear path towards it. So, in your opinion, what are some tools to first of all decrease the inefficiency of the governmental spending, and second, to try to facilitate the process of opening private investments in Lebanon?
Yeah, I mean, we rank 140 something in doing business in the world, and that takes time to fix, but it's not impossible. But I think this is part of the the disease that has hit the public sector. It's inefficient, it's incompetent, 90% of the time. And you have amazing public servants who are doing amazing work, but their work is wiped out by the other 90%. And we have one of them here, Director of Compliance at the Ministry of Finance, Mrs. Manal. She's one of the top policymakers in the country. If you ask her opinion, she will tell you how she feels about how the public sector in general is being run. So it's super frustrating, and I think it all starts with a decision. The political class, be it this one or the next one, has to say enough. We have to build a proper country. Well, actually, the problem is that they say it. They have to do it, right? And on the taxation side, I would add one thing. We actually pay a lot of taxes. If your personal income tax is not very high, look at all the indirect taxes that you're paying, and then the additional utility bills that you're paying that you're not supposed to be paying. Altogether, you will get very close to 40% income tax, directly and indirectly. So, if I were you, I'll go to the States and pay 40%. At least I get everything covered. Or maybe not everything, but...
What did you say?
Sorry. No, but my main point to you is the intention has to be there. And unless we as Lebanese people see the intention for a real change, I don't think the change will come, because the amount of people trying to make the change are outweighed by those who actually don't care or are incompetent to do it.
Talal, in fact, what you are saying, if I may say so, you're talking politics now, and you are saying, in fact, that we will not have a proper, correct economic policy in the absence of a proper political environment,
yes.
Proper governance. That's right. I mean,
the
two are very closely linked. I'm sure Diane would agree with that. I mean, I have a very quick question to you, if you can answer it. In the Lebanese problem began in 1993, when they thought there are going to be peace prospects in the Middle East, we're going to be resolved the Israeli conflict, and capital is going to come here, and they will influence, and we don't know what we're going to do with all this money. Therefore, don't worry about your fiscal situation. Spend, worry about revenue later on. Now, had this issue not arisen, had Lebanon been able to have a proper fiscal policy as of 1993 on, I think many of these issues we're talking about now would not have arisen. Would have been in a much better state. Prior to the war, Talal, in 1975, there was no fiscal problem at all, right? And we had balance of payment surpluses. The problem was, how would you stop the pound from appreciating? Hence the accumulation of the reserves of the central bank. So the question is, if you are able to change the fiscal situation, means you have to change the political situation here. The two are very, very closely linked. I hope you agree with that. I have a question to Ayan. I mean, I heard you talk a lot about the improvement in financial environment, the global financial environment, lowering of inflation for many reasons, including the ability to implement policy better, understanding policy better. But I mean, I was wondering on the other side of the equation, can one say that globally this has also been the case on the issue of unemployment and income and inequality, income distribution? I mean, is there a link between the two at all? Has one fed the other globally?
you mean income inequality leading
Yes,
to
and unemployment.
unemployment. So, first of all, in advanced economies, unemployment, at least at the unemployment rate, is not a problem. I mean, the issue is that unemployment rates are very low in the U.S., all-time lows. The euro area, the lowest since the crisis. If you look at Japan, one of the lowest rates since the 90s. But that did not translate into inflation. Now, there are some arguments basically in favor of this inequality-inflation relationship. Inequality, rising inequality basically led to some demand shortage. And that basically pushed the kind of the inflation down, or in a sense, you don't have the type of widespread aggregate demand you used to have. But I think these issues to be examined. With respect to the role of financial markets, the basic idea is very, I think, simple. The financial markets, when a country is open, forces the country to implement policies that are, in a sense, more stable. And some countries much better in terms of implementing these policies than some others. But as I mentioned, when you look at the broader data, what you see, openness is associated with lower inflation. Whether this is a causation, that's another discussion. And in the paper, we look at these issues. But you don't have, closed economies enjoying low inflation, many of them around the world.
Thank you. Any further questions?
Yes, thank you very much for Mr. Salman. Regarding the recent austerity that's being promoted in the media in the Lebanese case, we will have a problem later on that will lead to lower demand, which would force policymakers to make a plan to entice the aggregate economy, or else we'll have a very huge debt crisis, because as inflation maybe would go down, that real debt level would increase. How would the government later on, in case this scenario materializes, would react? Should it start any expansionary monetary policy and fiscal policy in order to entice, or other than the SAD agreement or the SAD convention that have come? And for Mr. Ian, in case inflation expectations did not materialize, as you have been promoting through your study, we would also have a global debt crisis, maybe globally. What would the IMF and World Bank do in such a scenario? Thank you.
Sure. On the austerity, so there is some austerity in the budget, but it's not to the significance that would cause a major blow to demand. The austerity that has been done has been mainly towards places where they were too generous in some cases. So if you look at certain areas in the spending of the government, sometimes it's inequitable, but it's generous to in some areas. So there was a sort of an effort to balance some of the expenditure items. But there's no real austerity, because as we mentioned, there's no real room to do it without structural reform. So if you want to fix the EDL transfer, you want to fix your debt problem, you need to reduce your interest rates, and you can only do that if the economy is doing better. So if the risk is always high, I think that's the real risk that will cause what you're talking about. Now your Eurobond yields are trading around 12-13%. That's massive. We're talking 1,000 points above US Treasury yields. Usually Lebanon trades around 450 points. So you're approximately 5% more than you should be, simply because of the perception of risk caused by low growth and no structural reform. So if you're able to start somewhere, your cost of debt will immediately go down. That will give you space. If you fix the electricity problem, that would give you space. And just stop hiring, which they have it in the budget now. So there's it's not an austerity measure, but it's practically you're not adding any more employees in the government. So you stop hiring completely. That resolves it. But all of that takes time, and that time we don't have. So the only solution is to have a positive shock from a policy-making point of view. I guarantee you, if you start now building one power plant, just one new power plant with a proper governance system, 3 percentage points, the yields will go down the same day. Just one power plant, because everyone knows this is the biggest problem in, fiscally. So if you see one stone being built in a power plant, that means they have agreed on a solution. So one positive shock will hopefully avoid this.
So, yeah, debt has become an important issue in many parts of the world. And since the crisis, debt has increased in advanced economies, in emerging developing economies. In some low-income countries, the problem is even larger because there is a serious transparency issue. The solution is basically to make sure these problems do not get out of control. In that context, we, of course, work with our member countries continuously, and we do analytical work. Our publication has a chapter on debt issues pretty much now every year. In the latest issue, we discussed this problem from the perspective of emerging market and developing economies, because there is this idea that debt is very cheap nowadays, maybe not necessarily for this country, but for many other countries. And some governments would like to borrow more. And we discussed the consequences of that. The issue, what the IMF and the World Bank will do, of course, they will do their best to help countries. These crises are never easy. We have seen the global financial crisis. We have seen some serious episodes last year. So it's important for governments to undertake the measures so they will not be in a corner when yields increase and they have to end up with payment problems. But let me stop there. Thank you.
Well, please join me in thanking Ayan and Talal for excellent, beautiful, insightful talks and reflections on the issues at hand. So please, let's